There are moments in our lives when we feel the weight of decisions bearing down upon us. We are constantly confronted with voices, some of them loud, some quiet, but all calling us in different directions. These voices, though they may sound similar at times, are not always the same. There is the voice of God, which guides, uplifts, and leads us toward purpose. And then there are the voices of our own thoughts, which can sometimes confuse, distort, and lead us astray. It is imperative that we understand the difference between these two voices because the distinction holds the key to our spiritual success and peace. To truly discern the voice of God from the voice of our thoughts, we first need to understand what both of these voices represent. The voice of God is one of authority, of peace, and of truth. It resonates deeply within us, cutting through the noise of our daily lives to speak directly to our hearts. It does not speak with urgency or anxiety, but with a calm assurance. It is a voice that reminds us of who we are and what we were created for, a voice that propels us forward in faith and trust. When we hear God's voice, we feel empowered, motivated, and assured that we are on the right path. On the other hand, our own thoughts can often be noisy and chaotic. Our minds are constantly filled with a barrage of ideas, opinions, fears, and desires. These thoughts come from various sources: our upbringing, our experiences, the opinions of others, and even our own insecurities. Unlike the steady, calm voice of God, our thoughts can feel frantic, like waves crashing against the shore. They can be self-serving, selfish, and driven by personal agendas. While God's voice calls us to rise above our circumstances and trust in His plan, our thoughts often tie us to our fears, doubts, and uncertainties, keeping us trapped in a cycle of indecision and confusion. One of the key differences between God's voice and our thoughts is the source from which they emanate. God's voice is divine, originating from a place of perfect wisdom, infinite love, and eternal truth. His voice knows the end from the beginning, and it speaks with the authority of one who holds the universe in his hands. It is not bound by the limitations of human understanding, and it always leads us to a higher purpose. God's voice is not only a guide, but a confirmation of His presence and His will. When God speaks, there is a sense of peace and clarity that comes with it, a deep knowing that what He says is the truth. In contrast, our thoughts are shaped by the human experience. They are filtered through our emotions, our past experiences, and our desires. While some thoughts may be helpful and lead us in positive directions, others are influenced by fear, pride, or insecurity. Our minds can become a battleground where conflicting thoughts war against each other, pulling us in different directions. The voice of God is clear, whereas the voice of our own thoughts can often be murky and indistinct. We might feel torn between options, unsure of what to do, and that confusion is a result of relying too much on our own understanding instead of seeking God's guidance. Another critical difference between God's voice and our thoughts is the way they affect us. When God speaks, His voice brings peace. It does not add to our stress or anxiety, but rather alleviates it. It may challenge us to step out in faith, to trust in His plan, even when we cannot see the full picture. But it does so with a sense of peace that transcends understanding. God's voice often calls us to do hard things, things that require courage and sacrifice, but it always accompanies us with the strength to carry out those tasks. It is not a voice that drives us to panic or rush, but one that calls us to stand firm and wait for His perfect timing. Our thoughts, however, can stir up unrest. They can fill us with anxiety, uncertainty, and fear. When we rely solely on our own understanding, we can become overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decisions we face. Our thoughts can cause us to question our worth, our ability, and our future. They can distort reality and amplify our doubts, whereas the voice of God calls us to trust. Our own thoughts often lead us to doubt. The voice of God speaks truth into the depths of our being, while our thoughts sometimes speak lies that try to pull us away from our purpose. There is also a stark difference in the nature of the messages we receive from each voice. God's voice is often simple, direct, and clear. It speaks to our hearts with wisdom and clarity, guiding us toward a path that brings us closer to Him. His voice does not contradict His word. It aligns with the principles of love, grace, forgiveness, and truth. It may challenge us to grow, to step outside of our comfort zones, but it always encourages us toward greater alignment with His will. God's voice does not seek to confuse or cause division. Rather, it calls us to unity, peace, and reconciliation. In contrast, our thoughts can be convoluted, self-centered, and at times downright contradictory. We might be uncertain of our direction, changing our minds repeatedly, or doubting the decisions we've already made. Our thoughts can lead us in circles, never arriving at a place of clarity or resolution. We may find ourselves questioning the motives behind our decisions, wondering whether we are acting out of selfishness, fear, or pride. These internal debates often create confusion and frustration, leaving us feeling stuck and unable to move forward. It is a voice that thrives in the complexity of human emotions, often leading us to act impulsively or based on temporary feelings rather than lasting truths. Furthermore, the voice of God is often accompanied by a deep sense of conviction. When God speaks, we feel it in our spirit, in the deepest parts of our being. His voice stirs something within us, a longing, a calling, a yearning to follow Him. Even when His message challenges us, it is never condemning. It draws us closer to Him and reveals the areas in our lives that need transformation. The voice of God does not shame us or make us feel unworthy, but lovingly corrects us, always with the goal of restoration and growth. It is a voice that beckons us toward holiness, urging us to live according to His will. Our thoughts, however, can be laced with self-condemnation. They can make us question our value, our abilities, and our worthiness. Often these thoughts come from the enemy of our souls, who seeks to remind us of our failures and shortcomings. Our own minds can be a playground for the lies that tell us we are not good enough, not smart enough, or not capable of fulfilling our dreams. These thoughts can paralyze us with shame, keeping us from stepping into the fullness of who we are called to be. It is also important to understand the role of silence in distinguishing God's voice from our thoughts. God's voice often comes in the stillness, in moments of quiet surrender. When we are still before Him, we are able to hear His gentle whisper. His voice does not compete with the noise of the world, but finds its way into the quiet spaces of our hearts. It is in the silence that we are able to hear Him clearly, allowing us to discern His will with precision. Our thoughts, on the other hand, can be loud and chaotic. They demand attention, and they often drown out the still, small voice of God. The busyness of our lives, the distractions of technology, the pressures of work and relationships, these things contribute to the noise that fills our minds. When we are constantly moving and never take time to be still, it becomes harder to discern the voice of God amidst the noise of our own thoughts. It is only when we create space for silence, when we choose to quiet our minds, that we can hear God's voice speaking clearly to us. To truly hear God's voice, we must cultivate an environment of surrender. We must allow ourselves to let go of our own preconceived notions, fears, and desires. We must learn to trust that God's voice is the one that will lead us to peace, purpose, and fulfillment. This requires a deep level of humility, recognizing that our own understanding is limited and that only God knows the way. We must be willing to set aside our own plans and submit to His perfect will. In doing so, we open ourselves to the divine guidance that will steer us toward the life He has planned for us. In conclusion, the voice of God and our own thoughts are two distinct forces that operate within us. God's voice brings clarity, peace, and truth, guiding us toward our destiny and purpose. Our thoughts, however, can often lead us into confusion, fear, and doubt, clouding our judgment and keeping us from fully embracing God's plan for our lives. The key to discernment is silence, surrender, and a deep trust in God's goodness. When we learn to listen for His voice and align our thoughts with His truth, we will walk in the fullness of the purpose He has set before us. The voice of God is calm, direct, and filled with truth. It offers peace, guidance, and assurance, even in moments of uncertainty. It leads us toward our higher purpose and aligns us with God's will. Human thoughts are often influenced by fear, insecurities, and past experiences, leading to confusion, doubt, and indecision. Unlike God's voice, our thoughts can be contradictory and may distract us from the path of peace and clarity. To distinguish between God's voice and our own thoughts, we must create moments of stillness and quiet. In these moments, surrendering our own desires and preconceived notions allows us to clearly hear God's direction and align ourselves with His will. God's voice brings peace and clarity, and this is one of the most profound truths we can experience in our lives. It is a voice that cuts through the noise of our everyday struggles and confusions, offering us guidance that is steady, sure, and unwavering. The peace that comes with hearing God's voice is not like the fleeting peace we might experience when things go our way or when our circumstances are calm. No, the peace that God's voice brings is transcendent, deep, and unshakable. It anchors us in the midst of the storms of life, offering a sense of calm that cannot be disturbed by external circumstances. When we hear God's voice, there is an immediate sense of relief, as though a burden we didn't even realize we were carrying has been lifted. It is as if we have been walking around with a heavy load on our backs, unaware of how much it is affecting us. And suddenly, in one moment of listening, that load is taken off. This is the peace that comes from knowing that everything will be all right. It's a peace that comes not because everything is perfect, but because we know that God is with us, guiding us, and ultimately in control. In the chaos of life, God's voice brings the quiet assurance that everything is happening according to His plan, even when we cannot see or understand it. Clarity follows the peace that God's voice brings. There is a sense of knowing, not only in our minds, but in our hearts, that we are on the right path. When God speaks to us, there is no ambiguity. His voice is not a voice of confusion or doubt, but of absolute certainty. We may not always have all the answers or understand the full picture, but when we hear God's voice, we know that He is leading us in the right direction. It becomes clear in that moment that we are not alone, that we are not walking through life blindly or aimlessly. His voice serves as a guiding light that illuminates the path ahead of us, showing us where to go and how to move forward. In the midst of our own struggles, God's voice often provides a deep sense of reassurance. It is easy to get caught up in our own emotions, worries, and fears, which cloud our ability to see things clearly. Our minds can become overwhelmed by the chaos of our circumstances, and it is in these moments that hearing God's voice is like a breath of fresh air. When He speaks, it is as though all of the noise and confusion fades away, leaving only His still, small voice of comfort and truth. In the face of uncertainty, God's voice stands as an unwavering source of clarity. Moreover, the clarity that God's voice brings doesn't just settle our emotions, it helps us to make decisions. Life presents us with a multitude of choices every day, some small, others significant, and it can be difficult to know which direction to take. Our minds are filled with opinions, advice from others, and internal desires, and all these voices compete for our attention. But when God speaks, the fog lifts and we are able to see things clearly. His voice doesn't come with pressure or confusion, but with a clear call to action that makes sense in our hearts. When we listen to His guidance, we are able to move forward with confidence, knowing that we are walking in alignment with His will. We no longer have to second guess ourselves or fear the unknown because His voice assures us that we are on the right track. The peace that God's voice brings also frees us from the burden of worry. How often do we find ourselves consumed by anxiety, overwhelmed by what ifs and worst case scenarios? Our minds race and we become paralyzed by fear of the future. But when we listen to God's voice, His peace transcends all of that. He doesn't promise that life will be without difficulties, but He does promise that He will be with us through it all. When we hear His voice, we are reminded that we don't have to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. We don't have to figure everything out on our own because God is with us, guiding and directing our steps. His voice is a constant reminder that we are not alone and that the Creator of the universe is actively involved in our lives, leading us toward what is best for us. This peace and clarity that God's voice brings are also linked to our spiritual growth. As we learn to discern God's voice, we become more attuned to His will and purpose for our lives. The more we listen to Him, the more we understand His heart, and the more we align our thoughts, desires, and actions with His. This is where true peace comes from, not from the absence of challenges, but from the presence of God in our lives. When we hear His voice, we are reminded of our identity in Him, of the truth that we are His children, and that He is working all things together for our good. It is in the clarity of His voice that we find our true purpose and calling. We no longer wander aimlessly trying to find meaning in the fleeting things of the world. Instead, we are anchored in the truth of who God is and who we are in Him. And this gives us a sense of peace and purpose that nothing in this world can take away. Another powerful aspect of the peace and clarity that God's voice brings is the way it helps us to navigate our relationships with others. Life is full of interpersonal dynamics that can be challenging and sometimes confusing. We may struggle with forgiveness, communication, or understanding others' motives. In these situations, God's voice speaks words of wisdom, offering us clarity about how to handle our relationships with grace and truth. When we listen to Him, He leads us in how to respond with love, kindness, and patience. His voice teaches us to forgive when we would rather hold on to anger, to extend grace when we are tempted to judge, and to seek understanding rather than react out of emotion. His voice provides the clarity we need to make decisions that honor Him and build up the people around us, even when the situation seems complicated or difficult. Furthermore, God's voice isn't just a one-time experience, but an ongoing relationship. The more we walk with God, the more familiar His voice becomes. It becomes the foundation on which we stand. His voice doesn't just speak to us in moments of crisis or confusion. It is a constant presence that guides us through all of life's ups and downs. When we become attuned to His voice, we can hear Him in the small moments of everyday life. He speaks to us in our quiet times of reflection, in our moments of worship, and in our times of prayer. Each time we hear God's voice, the peace and clarity that it brings become more ingrained in us, shaping the way we see the world and the way we interact with it. The beauty of hearing God's voice is that it transforms us. It doesn't just provide us with peace and clarity in our circumstances, it changes the way we approach life. When we allow His voice to be our guide, we learn to trust Him more deeply, to surrender our own understanding, and to rely on His wisdom. His peace fills us, and His clarity directs our paths. It is in hearing His voice that we discover who we truly are and what we were created to do. God's voice, with its peace and clarity, is the ultimate guide through the complexities of life, leading us to fulfillment and purpose. Our thoughts can be chaotic and confusing, often swirling like a storm inside our minds. The human mind is complex, and it can sometimes feel like there's a constant buzz of ideas, doubts, fears, and desires battling for our attention. We are bombarded with an endless stream of thoughts throughout the day, and many of these thoughts are contradictory, fleeting, and confusing. They arise from our past experiences, our fears, our dreams, and our anxieties, creating a mental landscape that can feel overwhelming and difficult to navigate. One of the most unsettling aspects of our thoughts is how unpredictable they can be. At one moment, we may feel confident and certain about something, but the next, a wave of doubt crashes over us, making us question everything. These shifts in our mental state happen so quickly that we can struggle to keep up, unsure of what is true or what direction we should take. It's as if we are tossed to and fro, unable to find solid ground. This unpredictability can lead to feelings of frustration, confusion, and sometimes even paralysis as we become overwhelmed by the constant shifting of our thoughts and emotions. Often the thoughts that crowd our minds are driven by fear and insecurity. Fear of the future, fear of failure, fear of rejection, and fear of not measuring up. These are all powerful forces that can cause our thoughts to spiral out of control. When we let fear dominate our thinking, it clouds our judgment and distorts our perception of reality. Instead of seeing things clearly, we begin to view the world through a lens of fear, making decisions based on anxiety rather than wisdom. Our thoughts become trapped in a cycle of what-ifs and worst-case scenarios, keeping us stuck in a place of indecision and doubt. In addition to fear, our thoughts are often colored by our past experiences. Memories of past failures, mistakes, or disappointments can creep into our minds, influencing the way we view ourselves and the world around us. These memories, whether we are conscious of them or not, can create mental blocks that prevent us from moving forward. We may begin to doubt our abilities, thinking that because we have failed in the past, we will fail again in the future. This self-doubt can be paralyzing, preventing us from taking risks or stepping out of our comfort zones. It is easy to get caught in a negative mental loop where the past dictates our present and future. Moreover, our thoughts can be confusing because they are constantly changing and evolving. What seems like a good idea one minute can seem completely wrong the next. One moment we may feel inspired and excited about a project or goal, only to have that enthusiasm fade away as new doubts arise. This constant shift in mental focus can create a sense of disorientation, making it difficult to know what we truly want or believe. We may struggle to make decisions because our thoughts seem to be in constant conflict with each other, leaving us unsure of what direction to take. This inner turmoil can be exhausting, as we feel like we are constantly battling with ourselves, unable to find the clarity or peace that we long for. Another reason our thoughts can be chaotic and confusing is that they are often influenced by external pressures and the opinions of others. We live in a world where we are constantly exposed to the thoughts and ideas of other people through social media, news, conversations, and advertisements. These external influences can seep into our minds, causing us to question our own beliefs and values. We may begin to compare ourselves to others, wondering if we are measuring up or if we are making the right choices. The more we focus on what others think or say, the more our own thoughts become tangled and unclear. We lose sight of our own voice and instead become consumed with the voices of the world around us. This external noise can drown out our inner wisdom and lead us further into confusion. Our thoughts can also be chaotic because of the sheer volume of them. Studies have shown that the average person has tens of thousands of thoughts every single day. With so many thoughts coming and going, it can be incredibly difficult to keep track of them all, let alone make sense of them. Many of these thoughts are random and inconsequential, but some can be deeply significant, influencing the way we feel and act. The challenge lies in distinguishing between the thoughts that are worth paying attention to and those that are simply distractions. It's easy to get caught up in the constant stream of mental noise and lose sight of what truly matters. In times of stress or uncertainty, our thoughts can become even more chaotic. When we are under pressure, our minds can race, and we may find ourselves overthinking every decision, every interaction, and every outcome. This overthinking can lead to mental exhaustion as we try to process every possible scenario and outcome. It's as if our minds are trying to anticipate every possible problem or challenge before it even happens, creating a sense of impending doom. In these moments, it can be difficult to quiet our minds and find peace, as the flood of thoughts continues to overwhelm us. The more we try to control or manage our thoughts, the more chaotic they can become, creating a vicious cycle that is hard to break. This mental chaos is not just a result of external circumstances, it can also be a reflection of our inner emotional state. Our thoughts often mirror our emotions, and when we are feeling anxious, frustrated, or sad, our thoughts tend to become more scattered and disorganized. Negative emotions can fuel negative thinking, making it even harder to find clarity. We may find ourselves ruminating on past mistakes, worrying about the future, or obsessing over things we cannot control. This emotional turmoil can cloud our ability to think clearly, leading us to make decisions based on fear or impulse rather than wisdom and clarity. The more we allow our thoughts to dominate our minds, the more we risk losing touch with our inner sense of peace and direction. When we are constantly caught up in the chaos of our thoughts, it becomes increasingly difficult to hear the voice of reason or wisdom that lies within us. We become disconnected from our true selves and our deeper sense of purpose as we are overwhelmed by the noise of our own minds. This disconnection can lead to feelings of frustration, confusion, and a lack of fulfillment. We may feel lost or unsure of who we really are as our thoughts pull us in different directions. It is important to recognize that while our thoughts can be chaotic and confusing, they do not define us. We are not our thoughts. Thoughts come and go, but our true identity is rooted in something deeper. The challenge lies in learning to observe our thoughts without becoming consumed by them. By practicing mindfulness and self-awareness, we can begin to separate ourselves from the constant chatter of our minds. We can learn to quiet the noise, to let go of the thoughts that no longer serve us, and to focus on the thoughts that align with our true values and desires. This process of mental discipline and self-discovery takes time, but it is the key to gaining clarity in the midst of chaos. Ultimately, our chaotic thoughts do not have to control us. Through practice, reflection, and seeking guidance, we can begin to regain control over our minds. It is possible to navigate the confusion and find clarity, but it requires a willingness to quiet the noise, to embrace stillness, and to trust in the wisdom that lies within. When we learn to master our thoughts, rather than allowing them to overwhelm us, we begin to experience a peace and clarity that transcends the mental chaos. Discernment requires silence and surrender, two practices that are often overlooked in the fast-paced world we live in today. In a society that constantly demands action, noise, and decision-making, the ability to listen with clarity and hear the voice of truth requires a different approach. Silence, in this context, isn't merely the absence of sound. It's a deliberate quieting of the mind, the heart, and the spirit. Surrender isn't about giving up or relinquishing control, but about releasing our need to control the outcome and instead yielding to something greater than ourselves. It is in this silence and surrender that discernment becomes possible, guiding us through the complexities and challenges of life with wisdom and understanding. In the noise of daily life, it becomes increasingly difficult to hear the still, small voice that often guides us. Our lives are filled with constant distractions, conversations, social media, news, responsibilities, and even our own internal chatter. All these noises create a mental clutter that prevents us from hearing the deeper wisdom that resides within us. Silence is not just a physical quieting of the surroundings, it is a mental and emotional stillness that allows us to be fully present in the moment. In silence, we make space for clarity. We clear away the distractions that muddy our thoughts and open our hearts to receive what is true, what is right, and what is in alignment with our higher purpose. When we seek discernment, we must first cultivate an environment where silence can thrive. It is in this space of quiet that we are able to listen, not just to external voices or the thoughts in our heads, but to the inner wisdom that often gets drowned out by the noise of our lives. The world is full of loud voices, and while some of them may have valuable insights, we cannot hear them clearly if we do not make the time to be still. In silence, we are not rushing to conclusions or trying to solve problems with our own limited understanding. Instead, we create the opportunity to hear, to reflect, and to allow answers to rise up from within us. Silence allows us to step out of our own mental and emotional turmoil and approach the decision-making process with a calm and open heart. Yet silence is only one part of the equation. Discernment also requires surrender, an active release of our need to control the outcome. In a world that often values certainty, success, and achievement, it can be hard to let go and trust the process. Surrender in this context is not a sign of weakness, but a conscious act of humility. It requires acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, that we don't always know what is best for us, and that there are forces greater than our own intellect or understanding. Surrender means acknowledging that we are part of a larger plan, one that is unfolding in ways we cannot always see or predict. When we surrender, we let go of the outcomes we are attached to and allow the natural flow of life to guide us. It is not about giving up our agency or will, but about trusting that there is wisdom in letting go of our tight grip on things. Surrender opens the door to greater discernment because it frees us from the burden of needing to control every aspect of our lives. When we are surrendered, we become more open to guidance, more receptive to insights, and more willing to step into situations without trying to force a particular result. Discernment without silence and surrender becomes clouded by our ego, our fears, and our desires. It is easy to make decisions based on our immediate wants, our insecurities, or our biases, but silence clears away those mental and emotional distractions, allowing us to approach decisions with a clearer vision. Surrender, on the other hand, removes the need to make decisions out of pride or fear of failure. It allows us to trust that the outcome, whatever it may be, is part of a greater plan that we may not fully understand at the moment. The process of discernment often involves facing uncertainty, and uncertainty can be a difficult space to navigate. We naturally want to know the answers ahead of time, to have control over the situation, and to feel secure in our choices. Yet, discernment thrives in the unknown. It requires us to step into the void with faith, trusting that the answers will come when they are meant to. Silence and surrender are key because they create a safe space for uncertainty to exist without panic or fear. When we are silent and surrendered, we can hold that space of not knowing without feeling overwhelmed by it. We begin to trust the timing of life, knowing that answers will come in their own time, not necessarily when we want them, but when we are ready to receive them. This doesn't mean that discernment is always easy. It doesn't mean that the answers will come immediately or that we will always feel 100% confident in our decisions. Discernment is a process, a journey of learning to trust, to listen, and to wait. It's about being willing to sit in silence long enough to hear what's true, even if it means facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves or the situation at hand. It requires vulnerability, because surrendering means letting go of the need to control or manipulate the outcome. It involves trust, knowing that even when we cannot see the whole picture, there is a greater wisdom that can guide us if we allow it to. In the moments of discernment, silence creates space for our hearts to be attuned to the voice of wisdom that transcends our individual thoughts and desires. Surrender allows us to let go of our attachment to specific outcomes, clearing the path for clarity and peace to enter. Together, silence and surrender create an environment where discernment can flourish, where we can make decisions not out of anxiety or fear, but from a place of trust, calm, and openness. The practice of silence and surrender also encourages us to be more mindful of the present moment. We often make decisions based on what has happened in the past or what we hope will happen in the future, but discernment is most powerful when we are grounded in the present, free from the weight of past regrets or future anxieties. In silence, we can be fully present, and in surrender, we can release the need to rush ahead. It's a dance between being fully engaged with the here and now and trusting that the future will unfold in its own time. Silence and surrender are not one-time practices, but ongoing disciplines. The more we practice silence, the more we become comfortable with the discomfort of uncertainty. The more we surrender, the more we realize that true control lies not in grasping and forcing things to happen, but in trusting and letting go. Discernment becomes a natural byproduct of these practices, one that leads us not just to better decisions, but to a deeper connection with the wisdom that resides within us and the universe around us. As we embrace silence and surrender in our decision-making process, we open ourselves to a deeper level of discernment that is not swayed by fleeting emotions, external pressures, or fear-based thinking. Instead, we find ourselves led by a quiet, steady guidance that comes from a place of peace and trust. This is the power of discernment, a process that, when rooted in silence and surrender, allows us to make choices that align with our highest good and the greater good of those around us.